Morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us. This is our third session focused on employees and employers and what we need to do in relation to the recent situation. Today we're going to cover two sort of big topics. The first being risk assessments and getting employees safely back to work and what your duties are as an employer. And then in the second session, I will cover a slightly more deep dive on what that actually means in practice from a HR perspective in terms of different categories of employees, employees who might still be having difficulty coming back to work, and really what the options are. A little bit of information on data protection and the sort of collecting health data. And then at the end, we will try to round up with a few questions. So how it will run today is that your camera and your audio are switched off. That just, we find, makes the sessions work more smoothly. So you're very welcome to have a cup of tea or a late breakfast. No one will see you doing that. So if you can, if you keep things switched off, but we've done that anyway. Q&As you can submit. We will try to answer a few at the end, but any that we don't get to that we think are, big questions that would be good for us to answer, we will absolutely come back on that, probably in a written follow-up. And we're also going to be running another session at the beginning of June to cover the new provisions on furlough when they're out at the end of May, and also I think looking at the tricky issue that is just coming around the corner on holidays and quarantine, and what the options are there for you as employers and what you can reasonably ask employees to do in those circumstances. So that will be the next session. But for this session, I will start by handing over to Nathan. Nathan is a partner who heads up our risk team, and he's been doing a huge amount of work around COVID and around safe returns to work.
Thank you, Karen. So a lot's been written and said in the last 10 days or so since the Prime Minister's announcement announced his roadmap for recovery, including and crucially a shift in emphasis to actively encourage those who could not work from home, those who cannot work from home, to go back to work. And it has been the case, actually, that lots of businesses have been able, in theory, to stay open during lockdown, provided they're not expressly prohibited from opening, so retail, non-food retail, for example, and provided they could reduce risks to the lowest level reasonably practicable. And in practice, some businesses have stayed open throughout, not just food retailers, but high risk areas like construction and manufacturing. And there are lessons that are being learned from that we can take into helping businesses reopen now. Also, others closed for a short period, but then reopened once they'd redesigned their workplace layouts and operating procedures, often with sector guidance. So Construction Leadership Council has provided, it's now on its fourth iteration of detailed guidance, and the British Retail Consortium, working with USDOR, has provided some helpful guidance for retailers. In addition to that, to facilitate businesses reopening or staying open safely, the government has, as you're probably aware, prepared guidance across 8 types of workplace, designed to help what they term to help create COVID secure workplaces. And at its simplest, what the advice is that you approach the risk of COVID-19 in the same way that you would approach managing any other health and safety risk, namely by risk assessment. Risk assessment, as you probably know, underpins our health and safety law and our enforcement. Before I get into a little bit more detail about that, we thought we'd just run a couple of short poll questions. And Sarah will do that for us. So there's the first one. How confident are you that your business can manage the risk of exposure to COVID-19 in your workplace? Are you very confident, unsure, or not confident? So if you could have a think about that and submit your answer to that one. And I'm not sure if has the second one come up yet. There we are. Thank you, Sarah. How confident would you say your employees are? So this is about your employees, that the risk of exposure in the workplace is being managed, or if you're not open, are they confident it will be managed? Again, very confident, unsure, or not confident. Okay, so we've got just over half, 57%, saying that they are confident, very confident that they can manage the risk of exposure, which is great. And that means that we've got just under half who are either unsure or not confident. And that probably reflects what we're seeing as well. Equally, the answer to the next poll is interesting in that only 33% believe that employees think there is a confidence, and 68 are either unsure or not confident. And that's an important point around the potential mismatch between how employers are feeling around the safety of the workplace and how their employees are. So thank you for your poll responses. And I think it's fair to say that the analysis that you simply approach this as any other health and safety risk is a little simplistic and underestimates the challenges that we all face, because of course this is a hazard, and a biological one, that emanates from outside the workplace, not something that you've got direct control of as you do with your other health and safety risks. It's also obviously a novel and invisible risk, and we see daily the science evolving around it. And most importantly, I think the poll illustrates this, employees and consumers are unsurprisingly nervous about returning to work, using public transport, going into confined or more confined spaces than their own home, when for the last 2 months they've been encouraged to stay at home. And we have seen, haven't we, lots of adverse comments since the lockdown about non-essential businesses staying open and poor worker treatment. And I've picked on Wilko there, sorry to Wilko, but they're but one example. And who knows whether those concerns had any foundation, but the reality of in social media and court of a public opinion land is that is less important than the perception. So clearly businesses need to take great care in planning for and actually implementing reopening, and that requires careful planning, good employee engagement, and strong communication. So I'll summarize the key points now, and then address some areas of particular angst that we are being asked about quite a lot. So this is a bit of a whistle-stop tour, so hold on to your hats. I think the first key point is that employers have always had a duty to ensure the health, safety and welfare of employees, visitors and customers. That is nothing new in that, nor is it new that, but it is often overlooked, that employees equally have a similar duty, a duty to look out for their own health and safety and for their colleagues, but also to a duty of cooperation with employers' health and safety requirements. That's set out in health and safety law. Karen will touch on the employee angles of that shortly. It's also not new that you have to do a risk assessment. As I've said, that underpins all health and safety management. There is a new suggestion about publishing your risk assessment on your website, which I'll come to. But more crucially, and this I think is potentially where there's scope for mismatch between employer and employee sentiment, is that this is not about risk elimination. The use of the phrase COVID secure is deeply unhelpful in this context. You cannot eliminate risk. And indeed, beneath the headlines of COVID Secure, the guidance is very clear in saying that, and I quote, "You cannot completely eliminate the risk of COVID-19." So I think it's important to have that in mind, that this is, as with all health and safety risks, a balancing exercise. That balancing exercise, that risk assessment, will be informed by the government guidance, and I'll come on to that in a sec. The important point is to appreciate it's not a tick box of things that you can do to make it safe. It's guidance on how you achieve your legal obligations. In traditional UK style, it's all part of our permissive rather than prescriptive regulatory regime. Freedom within a practical framework is how I think it is described, and it needs to be applied to the unique features of your workplace and your workforce. And it doesn't supersede any legal obligations relating to health and safety, to employment, or indeed equalities. So it's just non-statutory guidance. So it's there to inform your risk assessment. I'm afraid the burden of assessing the risk still remains fairly and squarely with the employer. You can use it as evidence of how you are fulfilling your obligations, and indeed that is the normal approach in all regulatory arenas. You follow the guidance as evidence of complying with the law. It's a priority order of steps in the guidance, though, and that is a common theme in non-COVID health and safety legislation. You have a hierarchy of control, and you start at the top, and only if you cannot achieve the top level do you come down to a lesser control measure. And that's why the emphasis on stay at home if you can is important, because only go to work if you can't is all about the highest level of protection is staying at home and working at home. Coming into work, you go down a tier. The best protection is 2 meters apart, rigorous hygiene and cleanliness, and only if it's not possible to do some activities more than 2 meters apart do you think about how you manage those, short duration, guarding, etc. PPE is a subject we've been asked about a lot because it is causing some anxiety. In the guidance, it's very much the last resort. It may be because there's you may think that's to protect PPE supplies for the medical arena, but actually that again reflects standard approach in health and safety law. So in all regulations, you try and eliminate the risk rather than rely on individuals wearing an individual barrier for them, dependent upon their correct fitting and remembering to use it. I'll come back to that in a minute. There is a regulatory risk around getting this wrong. HSE have said they will enforce failures. The Chief Coroner has encouraged coroners to think carefully about inquests where they get appropriate notifications of culpable human failure being a contributory factor to a workplace death. I don't expect significant numbers of inquests, but would be surprised, or prosecutions, but equally would be surprised if there were none. I think, though, the most pressing challenge is this confidence point. Employers may think objectively the workplace is safe, but how do your people feel? How do your customers feel? How do you deal with that response? A tricky area, which thankfully I will leave to Karen. And also, I think this reputational point extends beyond just managing your workforce. We've touched on the court of public opinion already, and I think we'll come back to that frequently in our daily lives. The confidence is really driven by how you engage with your workforce and how you continue to safely implement the procedures that you design to make them feel consistently safe. So there's loads in that. What are the sorts of things that we're getting most questions about? Perhaps surprisingly, it's about what should my risk assessment look like? I've said that risk assessment underpins all our health and safety law, and that remains the case. It's important. A risk assessment's important in regulatory terms, but let's look at it practically. It's a phrase that tends to turn people off, but at its simplest, let's just think about it as a means to make people as safe as possible. And considering these 5 factors, who might be harmed and how, and we'll touch on vulnerable people in a sec. What you're already doing to control those risks at the time of assessment, how are you managing it? What further actions do you need to take? Who's going to do it, and when they're going to do it by? And actually, there's very simple and helpful guidance, generic to risk assessments on HSE's website, which will be on the slide deck that we circulate after. The link's there. In terms of COVID risk assessment, because it's a novel risk, the guidance intends to provide a framework and the hierarchy, as I've suggested, and you must tailor your risk assessment to the circumstances of your business. It's a series of prompts for thought, and any of you who've looked at them will realise that they're quite lengthy. If you've looked at more than one, you'll realise there's overlap and similarities. So there's no prescribed format for your risk assessment. Use your standard format if that's what you're familiar with and that's what works. Equally, you could adopt the HSE's suggested approach on the link on the previous slide, because that's what they like, and then no doubt they would approve of that. The guidance in relation to the 8 types of workplace is lengthy. We won't go into that now, but the key considerations and themes that are consistent to all of them are set out on the slide. As I've said, it's a list of priority, a hierarchy of control in nerdy health and safety language. The consideration of vulnerable categories is important. Also, I think to be able to demonstrate that if you are asking people to work more than 2 meters apart, you've considered A, do I really need to do this activity? Is there another way of doing it? B, that you've documented your thinking, and C, you've put in place as many practical steps to minimize the risk. It's only for a short period of time, or people are working side by side, they're behind screens or barriers, they're partnering, so you're only working with a small group of the same people, you're minimizing the risk for cross-contamination. I think that's an area where we'll see the most challenge, is where people are having to work less than 2 meters. But also the good risk assessment, I think, will follow the employee journey through the day, how they arrive, what they do when they arrive, how they work, comfort breaks, traffic routes, rest breaks, and so on. So I saw a great video that a client had prepared where essentially different workers took employees who were essentially watching a new induction into their workplace through a video journey of the day, and that was able to demonstrate not only what you had to do, but that the whole journey had been thought about and considered. I think there's some other key considerations for your risk assessment that are not covered so much in the guidance. Active implementation. This is where most of the prosecutions that I'm involved in arise from. There is a risk assessment, but it isn't lived and breathed and actively enforced, and the communication of what employees and customers, what they're expected to do, how they're expected to behave, is critical. Pictorial and visual displays, particularly those that can be left up and as reminders, but equally as important, active monitoring that it's in place. We've all seen a snap photo of a building site canteen or a team meeting that is not socially distanced. That can undo all of the good work. So I would be documenting back the other way, that you're auditing, monitoring, taking pictures, your managers are checking it's happening, as well as carrying out surveillance of a health variety, you're encouraged in the guidance to think about the mental health of your employees, but physical health surveillance can be effective, from email reminders about how you're feeling today, have you got any of these symptoms, through to temperature checking in appropriate circumstances. And there are other factors to consider. What is the impact of your COVID risk assessment on your existing risk assessments? The obvious example being you required 2 people to lift an object before because that saved their back in a manual handling scenario. How are you going to do that if they've got to be 2 meters apart? So it may just, you need to just think through how those systems are changed and whether the control measures are impacted. And then HSE are very worried about reopening of premises risks, and I've listed some there. Some machinery takes a while to start up, needs very specialist people to do it. Are they part of the crew or are they furloughed? People going in haste to adapt their workplace, carry out renovations, put stuff up through the walls. Are you remembering about your asbestos survey and making sure you're not exposing people to other risks through that? As with plants that have significant water coolers and Legionella risks, and also your fire detection and emergency procedures, are they mothballed or are they back on form, and are your first aiders all back in the premises? All other things just to consider your workplace risks in the round. It's come as a shock to some that you have to engage your employees in this process. That was a bit of a shock to me, that people were shocked actually, because you've been required to do it since 1974. But it's interesting that the guidance uses the phrase "you must." I think it's the only time that "must" appears in the guidance. The rest of the guidance is suggestions of things you may consider. That's no doubt in response to union pressure, but in reality, that is the best way to get an effective risk assessment. Your employees are the ones doing the tasks. They walk through, they know the shortcuts that people take, they know how practical the suggestions will be, and not only can they see it to give you an effective risk assessment, but they can become your advocates because they're confident about how it's going to work. You know, and I've seen examples of where methods of working have been imposed upon staff with inadequate consultation, and the debate about that then is aired not employee to employer, but employee to social media, and you know, none of us want to go there. And there's a template poster that I can't read on my small screen, but essentially is the output of your consultation and your risk assessment, basically saying that you've carried out a risk assessment, you've got cleaning procedures in place, people are working from home where possible, and that you are managing transmission risk. That is designed to give as an output of your consultation, to give confidence to your employees. Most of that confidence will, of course, come from experiencing a disciplined, socially distant and hygienic workplace, but it's all part of the picture. The vexed subject of PPE, or probably more correctly RPE, so respiratory protective equipment. Loads of stuff in the press about this. And I think much surprise that the guidance pretty much encourages you not to use PPE, basically saying, yes, if you were using PPE for non-COVID risks beforehand, carry on. Only as a last resort, use it for COVID risks if there's a very high risk of transmission and all other better options have been exhausted. Indeed, if you need to use PPE, should you be doing the activity at all, or should the business be open? You should be managing it in other ways. and there is an analysis of why in the guidance that this is a different type of risk. It also comments on the marginal benefit of face masks. We've had a number of clients say, well, I don't feel comfortable about that. My employees don't feel comfortable. I want a belt and braces layer of extra reassurance. Well, I'm going to go beyond the guidance and say, and give my people PPE. Is that fine? I think there's two key points here. I think that's fine if, and the if is you don't allow it to take place, the place of measures up the hierarchy. There's a real worry that if you've got a mask on, you relax your guard in relation to other hygiene and staying 2 meters. So it's, I would say, incumbent upon employers who provide it as belt and braces to be extra vigilant around the measures further up the hierarchy. And also, reputationally, you may wish to consider using non-medical grade PPE to avoid criticism that you're diverting resources from the NHS. Do you have to publish your risk assessment? Well, no, you don't. It's not a formal requirement. You're encouraged to do it. They use the word expectation if over 50 employees. Again, I think that is to mollify the unions who were demanding it. My view is if you've got engaged employees, if you've co-created a risk assessment, if your employees can access it, if you can dishonestly look yourself in the eye and display that poster, then that is enough from a regulatory perspective. So for me, it's all about whether you think as a matter of perception for customers and wider community that you feel the need to do so, then that's the judgment. But from a regulatory perspective, not required. From a regulatory perspective, will HSE be coming to inspect my premises and will they be prosecuting? They've been inspecting remotely thus far, but they've just announced they're starting spot inspections of construction sites today. This is what Boris Johnson said. They will have spot inspections and employees can complain. There were 4,813 complaints between the 9th of March and the 7th of May. HSE doesn't have the resource to respond to all, but it has responded. There's been no formal enforcement taken, and the HSE has commented that actually where people have been falling short, their advice has been sufficient to lead to compliance. I think the triggers for investigation will primarily be complaints, or if you publish your website risk assessment and it's clearly inadequate, or following regulatory reporting of deaths, diseases, or dangerous occurrences under RIDDOR. I think that there is an expectation that there may be prosecutions. The HSE's views, I think, are currently articulated as on the screen there. So Sarah Albans, the chief exec, and she said in response to a question that it would be in extreme circumstances, and it would be where people were blatantly and maliciously not following the rules. Indeed, there are some interesting, to me anyway, legal arguments about whether the health and safety legislation is legitimate to prosecute for, because this is an external biological hazard. That's not what it was designed for as a piece of legislation. But beyond that, I think if you're genuinely doing your best to find a way of working, you've considered the potential risks and guidance, I think the most likely step is advice, potentially something by way of improvement notice. But it would require a strong public interest requirement to have a prosecution. But I think there will be some. We will see a clamour for accountability if something goes badly wrong in a premises and there are a number of there's an outbreak and a number of fatalities. So if you follow the guidance, will you be doing enough From a regulatory perspective, if you can show you've reduced the risks in your workplace, tailored assessment to the lowest level reasonably practicable, and this is the critical bit, you've actively implemented it and enforced it, and you're monitoring it, then yes, probably you are doing enough. From a regulatory perspective. From a reputational and employee engagement bit, the questions are more subjective. How will our employees and customers describe what we are doing right now? I think those are really important questions to ask alongside your documented risk assessment. And how will they view it through the lens of hindsight? Because reputations, what you say and do now will inform your relationship with your customers and stakeholders, but most importantly, your employees for many a moon to come. On the subject of employee engagement, I will turn to Karen.
Thanks, Nathan. So, assuming you've done all of those things, you've done your risk assessment, and you're in as good a shape as you can be, what I'm now going to look at is, what are the specifics in terms of communication with employees and different categories of employees, and getting them back to work if you can, and if you can't safely do that, what the options are. I think the point that Nathan finished on there is a really interesting one, and it's one that came out in a conversation I was having with someone yesterday who in the context actually of a role that I do as a school governor, and we were trying desperately to look at all the ways to bring certain pupils back to school safely and deal with the concerns of very real concerns of the employees. And we were talking about it, and the head teacher was saying, we will still be here at the end of this, and our employees will really remember how we dealt with this and how we looked after them and how we got through this period, which I thought was, just to have that in mind. There's lots of there's so much discussion on sort of technical areas of employment law, and various claims that are never brought that could now be brought, etc., which I think is interesting. But I really will focus in the next 20 minutes on the practical issues, and also just sort of bearing in mind that wider point of employee engagement and looking after employees in this time, which none of us really expected to be in. So looking at employees returning to work, first of all, I think it's considering which elements of the risk assessment that you've done will have an impact on terms and conditions, because there certainly may be quite wide-ranging elements of changes that you need to put in place to make sure that, at least on a temporary basis, the return to work is potentially safe. The most obvious of those may well be continuing to have remote working for a number of employees that wouldn't usually do that. I do think with roles that can be carried out remotely, there is actually an expectation of a certain level from businesses of kind of social responsibility to make sure that if it is possible, to really consider continuing to do that, because it's taking pressure off the public transport systems, and meaning that for employees that really do need to return to work because the role cannot be carried out remotely, essentially you're sort of doing the responsible thing to free up safe space for them to do that. So I do think that is a sort of big consideration for any of you that do have the ability for remote working. I know there are very real concerns potentially about impact on all sorts of elements of the workplace culture, through that remote working and on productivity. But I do think it's right now that is a very careful balance. And there were some quite interesting press stories over the last couple of days of employers that have started to direct returns to the office, where employees are saying, I have demonstrated that I can work remotely, and I cannot see the business need right now to return. For many other employers who I know who are on this call, either your employees have continued to work throughout this pandemic, and all of us, I'm sure, are very, very grateful for that and how difficult that has been for them. And equally, many of you now have a situation where it is necessary for employees to come back to the workplace so that you can be economically productive. So if you do need them to come back, I think it's looking at potentially, there might be things like changes to working hours, changes to their work location, potentially changes to pay if things like shift allowances are going to be affected, and maybe alterations to duties. So all of those things I think are reasonable in the context of the risk assessment, but it is going to be about consultation. If you have formal trade union recognition, you'll be bringing together that consultation on health and safety and risk assessments with any necessary changes you might have, like staggered arrival times, changes to all sorts of elements of the working environment. The point that Nathan made is really important. I think not letting slip on some of the things that are still important from a health and safety perspective outside of COVID. So there will be all sorts of nuances and consultations. So I think if you've got a trade union recognition agreement, absolutely start with the trade unions. We have seen some really effective work from the trade unions and from health and safety officials and in trying to get people back to work. If you haven't, then how else do you engage? Well, I think there are various ways. If you have a works council or a works committee, that might be a good place to start. But if it's usually set up for things like sort of internal matters not of great importance, and I think it's thinking about whether that really is the right level of engagement. So you might want to do staff surveys, but make them very really wide ranging, allowing for, as well as specific questions, allowing maybe for some free text for employees to say if they have any concerns, maybe asking teams to get together and discuss things from their point of view, so that, as Nathan referenced, they might identify to you specific risks that they think the business hasn't considered, sharing your risk assessment with them, maybe making pictorial diagrams or a video walkthrough of what the workspace would be like to get people comfortable. In terms of disciplinary rules and procedures, I think you do need to think about that. Make sure that they are fit for practice, because, as I'll come on to later, in terms of, it's one thing doing the risk assessment and having all the procedures in place and being really clear on those, but how will you enforce that, and how will you show basically a sort of zero harm attitude towards towards what you've put in place, and making sure that people are following the rules and they do understand how important that expectation is. I'll talk later on about sort of specific disciplinary dismissal issues, but do have a look, make sure policies are up to date, and if they aren't, by and large, they will be non-contractual, so you can amend them and include something specific around compliance with health and safety policies and policies in relation to the return to work. Think about how you're going to enforce this in practice. So if you don't currently have people, it would be quite common that right now you may not have people, particularly in an office environment, who have to spend that much time on health and safety. And in fact, it may now, particularly in the short term, become a full-time job for them to review and be able to ensure that procedures are being followed, that employees can raise questions, can raise concerns where they feel that things perhaps aren't being done as they should be. So you may need to look at job descriptions and identify if they need further training, and work with them to get the right people in place. So moving now on to specific groups of employees. So every day, our team normally meets once a month to update on things that are changing in the law and be clear on where we are and how we want to guide clients. And I have great sympathy for all of you at the moment dealing with workforce issues, because we are meeting on a daily basis at the moment to review guidance that's coming out and to produce our practical responses to that. So I absolutely appreciate that all of this is moving quite fast. So I have tried to boil it down as much as I can into simple categories for you this morning. So I think the key things to remember in terms of vulnerable employees, if someone is extremely clinically vulnerable, so someone, they will have received a letter from the government or health authorities telling them that they must shield and must not be attending work, there would be a strict liability in relation to them if you encourage them to return to work, or even if they volunteer to return to work and you say that it's okay. You should really be mindful of that category. They are extremely vulnerable and they should not be attending work. For the clinically vulnerable, they are a separate group, so they do have vulnerabilities that may mean that the workplace could be unsuitable for them. That will be on more of a case-by-case basis. You do need to think about how you would gather that evidence. So some employees, may say to you that they believe they're clinically vulnerable, and in the usual way that you would with a disability or illness type issue, you will probably on a case-by-case basis need to start talking to them and looking at what is the medical condition or other vulnerability that is causing them an issue, what can be done to further understand that. So I had an interesting case yesterday of an employee with asthma who wants to return to work, but really felt that she what should or would be in the category of someone who shouldn't be at work. She consulted her GP in a short GP consultation, and the GP said, actually, provided that the guidance is being followed by your workplace, you're not in a category of person who shouldn't be attending work. So she was actually, signed off to go back. So that might be something you can engage with. Occupational health can also help, but I think it's about understanding it. I'll come on to later on furlough, because it might be that if you don't actually need the full workforce, and some people are in this category, that could be a good option. You will have other employees who are shielding other people in their household who are extremely clinically vulnerable. Again, you need to review on a case-by-case basis and consider what is a reasonable option for that person. They will be under significant pressure to make sure that people in their household are safe, and they may obviously have no other choices. Perhaps they brought an elderly relative to live with them, and it wouldn't be appropriate at the moment to make alternative arrangements due to the restrictions on those people, leaving the household. So again, you would need to scope out with that individual what are the arrangements that they've got at home, and if they need to continue shielding, I think at this stage that's something that you would look to accommodate if you can. Pregnant employees are a separate category. Now, interestingly, they fall within clinically vulnerable rather than extremely clinically vulnerable. So they're not necessarily required to remain at home. However, my view on this, pregnant employees, you've always had to carry out a specific risk assessment for pregnancy anyway. We do know that for pregnant employees, pregnancy has been flagged as a vulnerability. And so it may well be inappropriate at this point in time where we are, within the pandemic, to ask them to return to work in close contact with others, even if you're following all of the guidance that you need to. There are options there, so you can alter their duties. So you might want to give them some remote working or other duties that they wouldn't normally do. But ultimately, if a pregnant employee cannot work because of a health and safety risk, you would usually look at a maternity suspension on full pay to protect their health and safety. And that may well be the case at the moment, that would be a wise step to take with a pregnant employee. So the possible options for these groups, we have got clarity that furlough is appropriate. So if you are an entity that can rely on furlough, so as long as you're not in receipt wholly of public funding, then furlough is a really good option to talk to employees about. There is some very lengthy and tedious discussion amongst employment lawyers about whether furloughing at 80% could be a detriment to these individuals. But, the reality is most employees in this scenario so far, we have seen, are happy to agree to furlough, even if it is on the 80%. That gives them the ability to remain off work and to keep themselves safe at home. So I would say furlough is a really good option. If you cannot offer furlough for any reason, SSP, so some of these categories of people the SSP regulations have been amended to allow for SSP. There was a conflict between furlough and SSP that hasn't been 100% resolved, but it does look like you would be able to rely on furlough in preference to SSP, and that's going to be better for your employees. Of course, if they're entitled to company sick pay, you may want to think about your policies and procedures on that, and whether you would be offering full company sick pay in the event that they are shielding. So that is something to think about, because company sick pay is different to SSP and is usually discretionary. What I would say on that is it's important to be consistent. So to think about what your policy on this is in general, and obviously not to vary how you apply company sick pay, particularly between, for example, different groups of employees. I think consistency is important there to avoid claims. If the company sick pay is in the employment contract, then there could be potentially a breach of contract claim if you haven't been clear enough about when it's payable. So that is definitely something to look at and consider. But as I said before, you may find that furlough is a pretty good option and that they would agree to, and that would remove the need to really think about that company sick pay option. And can you alter their duties to enable remote working? It may be that they cannot attend the workplace, but you may be able to provide them with work so that you can leave them on full pay while they're working from home. What if an employee in general will not agree to return to work? We are seeing a fair amount of this, of employees saying, the government has obviously done a very, very effective campaign on the stay at home. We're now in the Be Alert phase, which is far more confusing. And certainly a number of employees are sort of saying, well, look, it's still my choice. I'm not comfortable. all the things that Nathan outlined, I think, are really important. Sharing risk assessments, maybe the video walkthroughs, other steps like that to get people comfortable. If you can engage with the trade unions or work committees, or any work that you can do directly with employees, that will certainly help a lot. It's a hearts and minds campaign to get people back to work. If they have specific concerns, if you can get them to actually outline what those concerns are so that you can provide a potential solution rather than it just being a generic concern about returning. You may need to take that to an individual level to understand what that specific employee is concerned about. If the employee is not in a vulnerable category and you consider that you've carried out a thorough risk assessment that does deal with all the risks in the workplace, it may actually be justifiable to take action for unauthorised absence or direct that further time off will not be paid, or even consider dismissal. I do think those steps are fraught. They are fraught with difficulty and danger. There are potential claims that they can bring, which I will outline briefly. So do be careful, but you may reach the stage where that is an option that you need to pursue, particularly as time goes on. So it's one to remain under review, but it's certainly not the first option to reach for. You should do all you can to try and agree other provisions with them, which perhaps could be a period of furlough, or another type of leave. So I think lots of things to look at before you think about dismissal. So the sort of claims that they could bring, and these are day one rights. So breach of Section 100 of the Employment Rights Act. If an employee can establish dismissal is connected to a reasonable belief in serious and imminent danger to health. Again, lots and lots of discussion amongst employment lawyers and barristers on this. We do think that this is a category that employees may well seek to rely on, and certainly the unions may rely on. It should be possible for an employee to establish that reasonable belief. So it's their reasonable belief. So even if you have done all that you can as a business, if the employee still holds a reasonable belief, they may get over this hurdle and be able to bring a claim, be protected from dismissal and other detriment under Section 44. Whistleblowing, it's a different legislation, but actually a similar effect. If the employee is saying they've got a reasonable belief that there would be a breach of health and safety law that would either affect them or more widely may affect the rest of the workforce, or perhaps customers or clients as well. So those are the kind of key areas to be careful of. My practical tips on dealing with those before I get there are some more claims. Disability discrimination claims, that's quite an obvious area. If you think of all those vulnerable categories, they are probably individuals with underlying ill health conditions. They certainly all will be in the extremely vulnerable category, and many in the vulnerable category will have conditions that would be considered to be disability. So the usual requirements apply there in terms of making reasonable adjustments and not discriminating. And so do the requirements not to substitute your own views for those of medical professionals. So do be careful around this. I think there's so much in the media about the effects of COVID on different health conditions. I'm seeing a bit of a creep really in people sort of substituting their own views for those of an employee. So saying, well, you've told me that you suffer from this condition. Well, I read that that's not particularly vulnerable. So, and just taking it down that route. I think you do need to be careful with this. And it is one where ideally you would get a brief view from the GP or occupational health specialist that if you can't reach agreement with the employee, a view where you can describe what are the adjustments that you've put in place to help them return to work. So be careful about substituting your own view of what their capabilities are. But equally, it can be helpful, as I said, from the asthma case yesterday, actually, I'm seeing, we're starting to see some medical advice coming through that's quite helpful, that will say to the employee and help guide them and say to them, you can return if these adjustments have been put in place. And reasonable adjustments is wide. So do think carefully about whether you can alleviate the concerns through perhaps changes to their hours or, remote working and so on. Associative discrimination claims. Now, these probably won't come up very often. Let's hope not, but they could in relation to an employee who's shielding someone in their family who's suffering, who has a disability, or suffering from some other ill health condition and means that they can't go out. So I think with this one, it's more likely to apply in the public sector just because of how the law works on associative discrimination. But it's just a red flag for you to look at, that if they're saying that someone in their household has a disability and that's the reason they can't attend work, you would need to follow some quite careful steps there to get them comfortable with coming back if it's at all appropriate. Unlawful deduction from wages. So if you say to them, well, fine, you can't return, so we won't pay you for that period, their claim might be for unlawful deduction from wages. And obviously, finally, they might resign in response to your whole handling of the matter and claim constructive dismissal. So I'm afraid there is quite a wide gambit of complaints that could be raised. But in terms of mitigating that, I do think, good engagement with the unions, if you can get them on board and get them to advocate with their members that there is a safe system of work, then that's very helpful. Well-reasoned, documented decision-making, as you would always do in the case potentially of disability or other individual issues relating to an employee. So, the communications that you have with them to understand their situation and to follow up on it from a medical perspective will be important. Don't act in haste. So if they raise a health and safety concern that you find to be ridiculous because you have spent hours on a very thorough risk assessment and you know that it is safe, it is not enough to just sort of bat them off and say, no, we've done everything, it's safe, you need to be back at work on Monday. You would really be welcoming those comments about health and safety and having that, that sort of culture where you're saying, please let us know if there are concerns. And listening to those and trying to give a thorough and reasoned response. Now, realistically, you may find that is overwhelming, and it may be that what you just need to be doing is sort of sharing parts of the risk assessment, or perhaps you've done a short videos. There might be things that you can be sharing with them to keep things on track. But it's very important not to just have the quick email back that says, not interested, please come back to work. You do need to have that good paper trail that you listened carefully to health and safety concerns. And this will also help, I think, with the reasonable belief, because can an employee sustain a reasonable belief there's a danger to health and safety if actually you have demonstrated very carefully to them all the steps that have been taken to show that there perhaps isn't. So I think that's important. And then think about consistency. It's okay to treat some employees differently because they have an underlying disability. You do need to protect them differently to others. But do think about consistency and how will you within your HR teams make sure that your approach is consistent. I think if there are later complaints of unfair dismissal or detriment, what employees will do is seek disclosure of other situations that were potentially handled differently to theirs. So I think that sort of thinking about how will you have a system to make sure that you are talking as a team or you're sharing information to make sure that you're being consistent on things is really important. So childcare issues is an interesting one. As I said at the beginning, I've been working really hard with the governing body to try and get the school back, but we're still in a position where many employees don't have reliable childcare at the moment. There isn't a legal right to paid time off due to the disruption caused by COVID on the childcare side. Furlough is absolutely suitable in those circumstances, so you may want to look at whether that's a good option for an employee that's still struggling to work because of the school disruption. Outside of furlough, you could discuss and agree a temporary change. Maybe they're going to work different hours remotely, that's fine. And maybe as you begin to reopen, due to the pressures on the workspace, perhaps you'll have longer reopening hours and they might be able to share care with a partner or someone else and come in at different hours to usual. I think that level of flexibility is really key. If none of those options work, the employee there's some other places to go. So emergency dependence leave, which is unpaid and is only really designed for very short periods of disruption. You might want to take them through unpaid parental leave and the policies on that, because that certainly might help them get towards, the summer holidays. And then, as I said, furlough is another option. Ultimately, I think there is a potential risk of discrimination claims. This level of disruption, there are statistics to show this is having a greater adverse impact on female employees. So if you had in particular a large group that are affected by this and you're unable to accommodate them at all, I think that risk is there. On the other hand, that's balanced with, as I say, there is at the moment no change to the law that says that an employee telling you they have a childcare issue due to COVID has a right to paid time off. So it's all going to be about looking at all those different options with them and seeing which one might work best and keeping it under review. Data protection, I will try and do this really quickly, but it's just to flag to you the data protection elements. Health data is special category data, so it's the most protected level of data that you could have in relation to employees. You have to be very careful. when thinking about that. The advice is to carry out a data protection impact assessment if you are going to begin collating greater health data than you usually would. You need to think about whether the data that you're requesting is adequate, relevant, and limited to what is necessary. Now, this might fall within your risk assessments. You might decide as part of your risk assessment approach that you do want employees to share more health information with you than they usually would. For example, if they're unwell, they need to share with you if they have a temperature or any symptoms of COVID, so that you can take steps for a group that have worked closely with them to let them know. There is a question mark over if someone did test positive, over whether you as an employer, from a data protection point of view, should be sharing that information with the workforce. The ICO has provided really useful guidance, so I would direct you to look at that. It would answer all the questions that you have on the matter of whether you would be able to disclose that a particular individual is suffering from COVID. Then that will be partly on a sort of risk assessment basis. If it's necessary to protect other employees' health, then yes, but it may not be necessary to identify the individual. You may be able to go to a group and just say, it's come to our attention that someone that you have come into contact with. The test, track and trace may well help with this as well, might lift the burden from employers a bit, which would be a really good thing. Temperature checks, you need to think about why you would be doing those. We've had lots of employers ask about whether they can do them. The guidance says, yes, if you can demonstrate that there is good reason for you to do that, but you do need to tell employees what you're doing with that data, how you're storing it, how long for, and be transparent. What will you do in the event that they have a high temperature? Are you asking them not to attend work for a period of time? What is the next step with that? So when we send around the materials at the end, there's that link there, and I would really suggest that you have a look at that. So finally, just thinking about that, sort of making sure that these health and safety procedures are actually happening in the workplace. I think it is about thinking about how will you handle breaches. Are you going to be absolutely zero tolerance and say it's a disciplinary offence, to the extent of dismissal for a first offence, or do you want to be making sure that you have done enough training and enough guidance to make sure that employees are really aware of what they need to be doing? And the consistency point on this will be really important. It's slightly similar. I keep thinking back to when the smoking ban first came in, and I spent about a year advising on dismissals relating to employees that could not accept the smoking ban and would still just break the rules and sneak out and have a cigarette. And many employees in those circumstances very quickly got to a place of absolute zero tolerance, and it was very clear that dismissal would be the outcome. I think this is more difficult because culturally we're all having to relearn about spacing, and there will be people who forget, but I do think leadership's really important on this. If you are saying you want people to maintain a 2-meter distance, they must see everyone in the business, including the leadership, following those rules without exception. There is a balance, I think, between the employment law aspects of this and the health and safety aspects. If there are very many minor breaches or major breaches and they're not dealt with as a disciplinary matter, there could be questions. If other employees say that those breaches are putting their health and safety at risk, there will be a tension there about whether you are truly taking those risk assessments seriously and making sure they're implemented. So I'm afraid we just have 2 minutes left. So I just wanted to run a short poll. I decided to do mine at the end. Nathan did his at the beginning. I thought I'd do mine at the end to see whether I've changed your mind about it, I think. So it would be really useful for us to know which of these elements you are most concerned about, if any, and we will then follow up with further guidance for you and further materials. And as I say, we're going to do a separate session on the furlough rules from August, which will be different, and also on what to do about sort of the quarantine holiday pay issue, because I can see that's going to be quite a headache coming up very shortly in the next few weeks. So if you can vote on the poll, that would be great. I think we'll close that in just a moment so that we can finish on the poll results. We haven't got time for many Q&As, unfortunately. Nathan, is there anything significant that's come up that we can pick up on in this last 60 seconds?
Probably not a 2-word answer, so
no.
I'll respond. There's a few questions that I will respond to directly to the
Brilliant. Okay.
person.
And as I say, we are going to run another session in just 2 weeks' time covering these other issues. And if there are lots of Q&As on specific points from this morning, we can always bolt onto that an extra session to follow up on those as well. So I hope you found it useful this morning. I can't see the results of the poll. I've had some sort of technical failure right at the last moment.
Okay, I can
Can
tell
you see them, Nathan?
Yeah, 40% think that an inability to fully implement social distancing guidelines will be a barrier. Other issues, such as childcare, is 38%.
Okay.
Only 15% saying none expect full return to work, will continue remote working.
Okay. Well, I think we're all in that place. That's certainly my experience of what's happening with clients, what we're experiencing ourselves at work, and in other capacities as well that I deal with. So we will keep getting as much information to you as we can. If you're not currently signed up for our briefings and bulletins, do just my contact details are on here. Just drop me a line with your email, because we produce regular bulletins and news flashes as soon as things change, so we can keep you up to date. And as I say, we'll run another session in a couple of weeks. But thank you very much for joining us this morning, and I hope everyone has a lovely bank holiday.
For Tansty, powering your ambition.